The morning started like any other in the Galactic Council chambers, with delegates from 47 species gathering for their weekly session, discussing trade disputes and border regulations while sipping their preferred beverages and complaining about the temperature settings that never seemed to satisfy everyone at once. Ambassador Daniel Wright sat in the human section, a modest area near the back where Earth's representative had sat for 70 years since humanity had been granted membership in the Council. Watching the proceedings with tired eyes that had seen too many of these meetings where nothing important ever seemed to happen, he carried a single data tablet in his hand, a thin piece of technology that contained just one document, and when the session reached the open forum portion, where minor administrative matters were addressed, he stood up and walked to the central podium without any ceremony or dramatic pause. The chairwoman, a tall Veloxian named Cress with silver skin and 3 eyes, barely glanced at him as she acknowledged his presence with a casual wave of her hand, expecting perhaps another complaint about human shipping permits or a request for expanded trade zones that the Council would politely decline, as they always did. Daniel placed his tablet on the podium, transmitted the document through the official channels, and spoke in a calm voice that carried no emotion or anger, just simple professional courtesy that made the announcement feel more like a weather report than a historical moment. The United Earth Government hereby formally withdraws from the Galactic Council effective immediately, with a transition period of 90 days to conclude all existing contracts and obligations, he said, and then he picked up his tablet and walked back to his seat. While the chamber remained mostly silent except for a few confused murmurs from delegates who were not quite sure they had heard correctly, Cress looked at the document on her screen, blinked her 3 eyes in sequence, and then simply moved on to the next item on the agenda, treating the announcement as nothing more than bureaucratic paperwork that someone in the administrative offices would handle later. Far across the galaxy on the trade station orbiting Andor Prime, Captain Lisa Morgan was supervising the loading of medical supplies onto her freighter Meridian Dawn when her communication console beeped with an incoming priority message from Earth Command. She wiped the sweat from her forehead, left the cargo bay where her crew was working, and went to her private quarters to read the message in peace, expecting maybe new shipping orders or a warning about pirate activity in the outer sectors. The message was short and direct, telling all human ships and personnel to conclude their current business and return to human space within 90 days, with no explanation given except that Earth was withdrawing from the Council, and all operations in Council space would cease. Lisa sat down heavily on her bunk, reading the message 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly, and then she called her crew together in the mess hall where they gathered around the table with confused faces. "We're going home," she told them, and when they asked why, she could only shrug because the message had not given her any reasons, just orders. Her first officer, a young man named Pete Collins who had never actually lived on Earth, asked if something bad had happened, if there was a war or a crisis, but Lisa shook her head and said she did not know anything more than what the message said. The crew began packing their personal belongings and preparing the ship for departure while Lisa went to inform the station master about their early departure, walking through corridors she had walked hundreds of times over the past 5 years. The Andorian station master, a friendly being named Vec who always had tea ready when she visited, looked surprised when she explained that this would be her last run and that she would not be renewing her docking contract. Vec asked if the humans were angry about something, if the Council had passed some regulation that upset them, but Lisa honestly told him she did not know. She was just following orders from home. On the medical colony of Kelser Prime, Commander Jake Peterson walked through the hospital wings with a heavy heart, watching his staff of 30 human doctors and nurses as they treated their alien patients with the same care and dedication they always had. The recall order had reached him 2 days ago, and he had spent those days trying to figure out how to tell his team and how to transfer their patients to local care without causing panic or disruption. The human medical staff had been working on Kelser Prime for 12 years, building relationships with patients and local doctors, and now they had to pack up and leave within weeks. Jake called a meeting in the hospital cafeteria after the night shift ended, and he watched the faces of his tired staff as they gathered around, still wearing their medical scrubs and looking forward to rest. He told them about the recall order as gently as he could, and he watched confusion spread across their faces, followed by questions he could not answer. Dr. Susan Mills, who had delivered over 300 Kelsorian babies during her time here, asked if they had done something wrong, if there had been complaints about their work. But Jake assured her that this was not about their performance. This was a decision made at the highest levels of Earth government. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity as human facilities across council space began their quiet shutdown procedures, with workers packing equipment, transferring files, and completing final obligations with professional efficiency. On the communications relay station at the edge of the Zetar system, technician Chris Bailey spent his last days training the Zetarian replacement crew on how to maintain the equipment, writing detailed manuals and showing them every quirk and problem that might arise. The Zetarians seemed capable enough, though they complained about the long shifts and the isolation of the station, things that Chris had never really minded because somebody had to do the work. Human cargo ships finished their final deliveries across dozens of worlds. Human construction crews completed their projects and handed over the keys. Human teachers gave their last lessons to alien students, and human diplomats closed their embassies with quiet dignity. There were no protests, no angry speeches, no demands for apologies or changes, just a steady stream of humans boarding ships and heading back toward Earth and the other human colonies in their own space. Some aliens noticed and asked questions, wondering why the humans were leaving, but most barely paid attention because humans had never been the most visible or vocal members of the council anyway. The council itself held no special sessions about the human withdrawal, issued no statements of regret or attempts to negotiate a reversal, because most of the delegates saw humanity as a minor species that had contributed little of importance during their 70 years of membership. If the humans wanted to leave, then let them leave, and the galaxy would continue as it always had, or so the council believed in their comfortable ignorance of what was about to unfold. 6 months had passed since the humans departed from council space, and Trade Minister Velthar of the Sarnathi delegation sat in his office reviewing the quarterly economic reports with growing confusion that turned slowly into alarm. The numbers made no sense at first, showing a steady increase in shipping times and costs across the outer rim territories, and he kept checking his data for errors because surely something this significant would have been noticed earlier by someone. Shipping times between the frontier worlds and the core sectors had increased by 40% on average, with some routes taking twice as long as they had a year ago, and the costs had risen proportionally because ships were taking longer routes or refusing certain runs altogether. Velthar dug deeper into the data, cross-referencing shipping manifests and route schedules, and that was when he discovered something that made his scales turn cold. Human shipping companies had operated over 60% of the long-haul routes through dangerous or unprofitable sectors, taking their small freighters through asteroid fields, past unstable stars, and into regions where pirates occasionally prowled. Other species had always avoided these routes, preferring the safe and profitable core runs, but the humans had quietly filled that gap without anyone really noticing because the goods always arrived on time, and the frontier colonies never went without supplies. Now those routes were either abandoned or being serviced irregularly by non-human companies that charged premium rates and refused to guarantee delivery times, claiming the risks were too high for standard contracts. Velthar realized with growing horror that entire colony worlds were facing supply shortages because no one wanted to make the dangerous runs that humans had been making for decades. And when he brought this to the attention of the council, they simply suggested the affected colonies offer higher payments to attract shipping companies. At the Galactic Hospital on Praxis Station, Dr. Zelina stared at the waiting room monitors with exhaustion, pulling at her features, watching the queue of patients that now stretched back for hours instead of the 30 minutes that had been normal just a year ago. Her emergency department was drowning in patients and her staff was working double shifts trying to keep up. But they were falling further behind every day. She had requested additional staff from the Council Medical Bureau 3 times, but each time she was told that qualified doctors and nurses were in short supply, and she should make do with what she had. Zelina knew exactly why they were in short supply, because she had been the chief medical officer when the human staff had departed 6 months ago, and she had watched 30 doctors and 50 nurses pack their belongings and say goodbye to colleagues they had worked alongside for years. At the time, she had thought it would be difficult but manageable to replace them, but she had been wrong in ways she was only now beginning to understand. The human medical staff had always taken the night shifts without complaint, had always volunteered for the difficult cases that other doctors found too challenging or too time-consuming, and had always been willing to work in the quarantine wards and infectious disease units that other species avoided. Dr. Susan Mills had been one of those humans, a quiet woman who had worked in the emergency department for 8 years, and who had somehow always been there when the worst cases arrived, never asking for premium pay or special recognition, just doing her job with steady competence. Zelina remembered how Susan would stay late to train new staff, how she would cover shifts when others called in sick, and how she had a gift for calming panicked patients with her gentle voice and steady hands. Now that Susan was gone, along with all the other human medical staff, Zelina finally understood how much they had been holding the hospital together. On the mining colony of Vex Prime, the power grid failed for the 3rd time in 2 months, plunging the underground settlements into darkness and shutting down life support systems until the backup generators kicked in. The colony administrator, a Vexlan named Court, stood in the control room and shouted at his engineering team to fix the problem, but they kept telling him the same thing they had told him the last 2 times, that they did not understand why the system kept failing because everything looked fine on the diagnostic screens. Finally, one of the older engineers, a woman named Tessa, who had worked with the human contractors, explained the truth that Court did not want to. Here the human engineering firm headed by a man named Kyle Harris had designed and maintained the power distribution network across 70 Vexlan frontier stations for the past 15 years, and they had done it so well that the Vexlan engineers had stopped really learning how the system worked. Just calling the humans whenever something went wrong, Kyle and his team would arrive within hours, fix the problem, and refuse any payment beyond their basic maintenance contract, saying they were happy to help. The Vexlan engineers had grown dependent on this arrangement, and now that the humans were gone, they were discovering that the power network was far more complex than they had realized. Kyle had apparently made hundreds of small modifications and improvements to the aging infrastructure over the years, keeping it running far beyond its designed lifespan through constant attention and clever engineering that was not documented in any official manuals because he had just done the work without bothering to file reports. The Vexlan engineers could follow the basic schematics, but they did not understand the logic behind Kyle's modifications, and every time they tried to fix one problem, they seemed to create 2 more. The agricultural world of Themis faced an even more severe crisis when their planetary irrigation system collapsed during the growing season, threatening the crops that fed 3 billion people across multiple worlds. The Themisian government called an emergency meeting and demanded answers from their infrastructure department, asking how such a critical system could fail so catastrophically. The infrastructure minister, a nervous man who had held his position for only 2 years, explained that the human engineering firm Carter Solutions had maintained the irrigation network for 20 years under a contract that had been renewed automatically, without anyone really paying attention to what they did. The humans had charged minimal fees, always responded to problems within hours, and had kept the ancient irrigation system running through constant upgrades and repairs that they had funded mostly out of their own pockets because they said it was easier than filing requisition forms and waiting for government approval. Now the local Themisian engineers who were trying to fix the collapsed system were discovering that the humans had essentially rebuilt the entire network over the years, replacing old components with new ones and creating a hybrid system that was far more efficient than the original design but completely undocumented. The engineers found notes scrawled on equipment housings, written in English with helpful diagrams and warnings about which parts needed regular attention, but without the humans there to explain their work, the notes were not enough. The irrigation system remained offline, and the Themisian government had to import food at enormous cost while their crops withered in the fields. Similar stories began emerging across council space as the months passed, each one a small crack in the foundation that no one had realized existed. A communications relay network began experiencing blackouts because the human technicians who had maintained it were gone. A border monitoring system failed to detect smugglers because human operators had been the only ones willing to work in the isolated outposts, and a waste recycling plant on a core world shut down because the human workers who had kept it running were no longer there to handle the jobs that other species found beneath their dignity. The council held meetings to address these problems, forming committees and subcommittees to investigate the infrastructure failures and supply chain disruptions. But they still did not see the pattern that was emerging. They treated each problem as separate and isolated, never connecting them to the departure of humanity, never asking themselves why all these systems had started failing at the same time. It would take several more months before the truth became impossible to ignore, before the council was forced to confront the reality that they had lost something far more valuable than they had ever known. 1 year after humanity had quietly withdrawn from the Galactic Council, the cracks that had appeared in the first months had widened into chasms that could no longer be ignored, and the council convened an emergency session that drew every delegate from their homeworlds with urgent messages that this was not routine business. Councillor Thrace of the Zentari stood at the central podium with a thick report in his hands, and his normally calm demeanor had been replaced by visible distress as he began presenting the economic analysis that his team had spent 3 months compiling. The numbers were devastating, showing that overall economic output across council space had dropped by 18% since the human departure, with some sectors experiencing declines of over 30%. Trade routes were collapsing, infrastructure was failing at an accelerating rate, and productivity was declining across almost every measured category, from medical care to manufacturing to agriculture. Thrace explained that his team had initially assumed these were normal economic fluctuations, or perhaps the result of the recent drought on the agricultural worlds, but as they dug deeper into the data, they found the same pattern repeating everywhere, a pattern that pointed to a single cause that the council had been unwilling to acknowledge. The humans had been doing far more work than anyone had realized, filling gaps and maintaining systems that other species had taken for granted, and now that they were gone, everything they had been quietly holding together was falling apart. The chamber erupted in arguments and denials, with delegates from the core worlds insisting that this was exaggerated, or that temporary economic adjustments were normal. But Thrace silenced them by displaying specific examples on the main view screen. The mining output on Vex Prime had dropped by 40% because the power grid kept failing. The agricultural exports from Themis had ceased entirely because their irrigation system was still offline, and shipping costs had increased so much that some frontier colonies were considering abandoning their settlements because they could not afford basic supplies. Admiral Cathorn of the Council. Defense Forces presented an even more alarming report about military readiness, his gruff voice carrying across the silent chamber as he explained that the Council's ability to defend its borders had been severely compromised. Human ships and personnel had patrolled the unstable border regions with the Krathian Empire for decades, covering sectors that other species found too dangerous or too boring for long-term deployment. The humans had never complained about these assignments, had never demanded hazard pay or special recognition. They had just done the work because someone needed to do it. Now those border regions were unmonitored, and the Krathians were already probing the defenses, sending scout ships into council space to test response times that had gone from hours to days or weeks. Worse still, Cathorn explained, the human tactical advisors who had trained most of the council's specialized rapid response units were gone, and without them, coordination between different species' military forces had deteriorated badly. The humans had possessed a natural talent for understanding how different species thought and fought, and they had used that understanding to create training programs that brought diverse military units together into cohesive forces. Cathorn played a recording from a recent training exercise that had gone disastrously wrong, with ships from 3 different species failing to coordinate their movements and nearly firing on each other because the communication protocols developed by human advisors were not being followed correctly. The human advisors had been more than just teachers, Cathorn admitted. They had been translators and mediators who understood how to bridge the gaps between species that had different military traditions and command structures. On Earth, former Ambassador Daniel Wright watched the council proceedings through the public broadcast feed, sitting in his comfortable home in Seattle with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. President Helen Martinez had called him earlier that morning, asking if he thought humanity should offer assistance now that the council was clearly struggling, and Daniel had spent hours considering his answer. He understood the impulse to help, because that was what humans did. They saw problems and they fixed them without worrying too much about recognition or reward. But he also knew that helping now would teach the wrong lesson. The council needed to understand what they had lost, needed to feel the full weight of their mistake, or they would never truly value what humanity had contributed. Daniel had tried for years to make the council see that humans were not just another minor species filling seats at meetings, that they were providing essential services that held the council's expansion together. But his warnings had been dismissed as self-aggrandizement or ignored entirely. Now the council was learning the hard way, and as much as it pained him to watch systems fail and people suffer, he knew that intervention now would only delay the real reckoning. Communications Officer Nina Foster sat in the monitoring station at the lunar base, listening to the steady stream of distress calls coming from council space and fighting the urge to respond. Human ships in nearby space maintained strict orders not to respond unless lives were in immediate danger, a policy that Nina understood intellectually, but struggled with emotionally every time she heard the desperation in the voices calling for help. A Veloxian cargo ship was stranded near the Korath Nebula with engine failure, calling for any ship in range to assist with repairs. But Nina knew that a dozen non-human ships had passed within range and ignored the distress call, because helping would mean deviating from their profitable routes. 6 months ago, any human ship within 3 days' travel would have responded immediately, would have dropped everything to help a stranded vessel regardless of species or potential profit, because that was what you did in space where danger was always present and help was often far away. Nina had been on rescue missions herself, had spent days helping repair damaged ships and asking nothing in return except perhaps a shared meal and stories about where they were headed. And the hardest part of her job now was sitting here and doing nothing while people needed help. The colony of New Destiny provided perhaps the most dramatic example of what happened when the humans left, because it was a joint council venture on a harsh frontier world that had been meant to showcase interspecies cooperation. The human colonists had been among the first to arrive, doing the dangerous work of establishing initial infrastructure and testing systems in an environment with toxic atmosphere, extreme temperatures, and unpredictable geology. They had lost people in those early years, had buried friends who died in accidents and equipment failures, but they had kept working until the colony was stable enough for other species to arrive and settle. Now, 1 year after the humans had departed, the remaining colonists were evacuating because everything was falling apart in ways they had not anticipated. The human colonists had been quietly fixing hundreds of small problems every day, maintaining systems, adapting technology to the planet's harsh conditions, and generally keeping the colony running through constant attention and improvisation. The other species had not noticed this work because it was invisible when it was being done, only becoming visible now that it had stopped. The atmospheric processors kept shutting down because no one knew how to clean the filters properly or replace the components that wore out from constant exposure to corrosive atmosphere. The power generators were failing because the cooling systems that humans had jury-rigged were no longer being maintained, and the food production facilities were producing half their normal output because the growing chambers required daily adjustments that humans had made without documenting them. The non-human colonists had tried to learn these tasks, but the humans had left so quickly that there had been no time for proper training, and now the colony that had taken 10 years to build was being abandoned after just 1 year, without the humans who had made it possible. The council's emergency session stretched across 3 days of heated debate and finger-pointing, with delegates arguing about who was responsible for the crisis and what should be done to address it. Some suggested hiring contractors from outside the council to replace human services, but investigations revealed that most of the humans who had worked in council space were not independent contractors, but employees of Earth-based companies that had stopped accepting council contracts. Others proposed training programs to teach council species how to do the work humans had been doing, but the scale of what needed to be learned was overwhelming, covering everything from ship maintenance to medical care to infrastructure. Management. Counselor Thrace finally cut through the arguments with a simple statement that brought uncomfortable silence to the chamber. He said that the council had treated humans as a minor species whose contributions were insignificant, and now they were paying the price for that arrogance. And the only question that mattered was whether they would continue to deny reality or finally admit they had made a terrible mistake. 18 months after humanity's withdrawal from the Galactic Council, the full scope of what had been lost finally crystallized into undeniable truth during a special investigative session that would later be called the Day of Reckoning by historians who studied this period. Counselor Shenatar of the Velox Union had spent 6 months leading a comprehensive research team across council space, interviewing thousands of workers, examining millions of records and documenting every system failure and service gap that had emerged since the humans departed. Now he stood before the assembled council with a report so detailed and damning that no one could dispute its conclusions, though many would wish they could. The presentation began with simple statistics that painted a grim picture of economic collapse. But Shenitar quickly moved beyond numbers to show what those numbers meant in practical terms. He displayed images of abandoned colonies, closed hospitals, failing infrastructure, and supply shortages that affected billions of people across dozens of worlds. Then he began explaining the pattern that connected all these failures, showing how humans had filled gaps in the council's economy that no one else wanted to fill, taking the dangerous jobs, the unprofitable routes, the tedious maintenance work, and the unglamorous positions that other species considered beneath their status. Shenitar presented data showing that humans had operated 67% of long-haul shipping routes through dangerous space, had comprised 42% of medical staff in frontier hospitals, had maintained 73% of infrastructure in remote colonies, and had provided 81% of emergency response services across council space. These numbers shocked the chamber into silence, because most delegates had assumed human contributions were minimal, perhaps 5 or 10% of key services at most. The revelation that humans had been doing the majority of essential work in many sectors was difficult to accept, but the evidence was overwhelming. What made the report even more disturbing was the breakdown of why other species had not filled these roles. Shenitar showed employment records indicating that non-human applicants routinely rejected postings to frontier colonies, dangerous routes, or maintenance positions, preferring jobs in core worlds with better pay, higher status, and more comfortable working conditions. The humans had not been preventing other species from doing this work. Shenitar explained. They had simply been willing to do work that others refused, and they had done it competently and without complaint for decades. The council called witnesses to testify about their experiences working with humans, and one of the first was a Kelsorian engineer named Mira, who had trained under a human technician named Chris Bailey at the Kepler station for 3 years. Mira stood nervously at the podium, her voice shaking as she began speaking about what she had learned from Chris. And within minutes she was crying as she described a man who had taught her that good engineering was not about impressive projects or recognition, but about the small fixes that prevented disasters and kept people safe. Chris had worked 16-hour shifts during the station crisis 3 years ago when a cascade of system failures had threatened thousands of lives. Mira explained through her tears, and he had refused any extra payment or recognition, saying he was just doing his job. He had shown her how to diagnose problems by listening to the subtle sounds equipment made, how to anticipate failures before they happened, and how to take pride in work that no one would notice if it was done correctly, because everything would just keep working smoothly. Chris had been 56 years old, had spent 30 years maintaining stations and ships across council space, and had never once been promoted to a management position or received any awards, apparently content to do the work he loved without seeking glory. Mira told the council that after Chris left, she had tried to maintain the station using everything he had taught her, but she realized within months that she had only learned a fraction of what he knew, and more importantly, she lacked the mindset that had made him so effective. Chris had genuinely cared about the station and everyone on it, had taken personal responsibility for keeping systems running, and had worked with a dedication that came from internal motivation rather than external rewards. Mira admitted that she was good at her job, but she worked for the paycheck and the status, and when problems arose outside her scheduled shift, her first instinct was to call someone else rather than fix it herself the way Chris would have done. The council heard similar testimony from dozens of witnesses over the following days, each one describing human colleagues who had been exceptional, not because they possessed superior technology or intelligence, but because they approached their work with an attitude that other species found difficult to understand or replicate. A Sarnathi doctor described how her human colleague named Susan Mills had treated the poorest patients with the same care as the wealthy ones, never asking about their ability to pay before providing treatment. A Zentari ship captain talked about a human navigator named Greg Stone, who had always volunteered for the dangerous routes through asteroid fields, saying someone had to do it and it might as well be someone who enjoyed the challenge. A Veloxian teacher named Kess spoke about a human educator named Linda Page, who had spent 12 years teaching on a remote colony world, helping students from 6 different species learn to work together and understand each other's perspectives. Linda had organized cultural exchange programs, had learned to speak 4 alien languages fluently, and had created teaching materials that other educators across council space had adopted, all while earning a salary that was considered poverty level by core world standards. When Kess had asked Linda why she stayed in such a difficult posting, when she could easily get better positions elsewhere, Linda had said she stayed because the students needed her and she felt she was making a difference. The investigation revealed that human diplomats had quietly mediated dozens of minor disputes before they escalated into major conflicts, often working behind the scenes without official recognition, because they felt preventing problems was more important than receiving credit for solving them. Human traders had extended credit to struggling colonies, sometimes never collecting payment when they knew the colonies could not afford it. Human scientists had shared research freely rather than hoarding it for patent profits. Human artists had created works celebrating other species' cultures rather than focusing only on human themes. Chancellor Vortek, who had led the Galactic Council for 20 years and had presided over the session when humanity withdrew without paying much attention, now sat in his office late at night reviewing the reports and facing the magnitude of his failure. He had always considered himself a fair leader who treated all species equally. But he realized now that equal treatment was not the same as recognition or appreciation. The humans had been doing essential work that held the council together, and he had dismissed them as insignificant because they did not demand attention or push for prestigious positions. Vortek remembered Daniel Wright standing at that podium 18 months ago, making the quiet announcement of Earth's withdrawal, and he remembered thinking it was no great loss because humans had never seemed to contribute much to council debates or major policy decisions. Now he understood that humans had been contributing in ways that were more fundamental than policy debates. They had been the foundation upon which council expansion had been built, the invisible workforce that made everything else possible, the prestigious projects that core world species competed for, the exploratory missions that generated excitement and media attention, the scientific breakthroughs that won awards. All of these had been supported by human labor in unglamorous roles that no one had bothered to notice. The council's investigation concluded with a final session where Shentar presented his team's core finding that humanity had not been a minor member species, but rather an essential component of council civilization, and their departure had revealed a fundamental flaw in how the council valued work and contribution. The council had created a hierarchy where certain types of work were considered prestigious and worthy of recognition, while other types of work were considered menial and beneath the attention of educated or ambitious individuals. Humans had been willing to do the work that others considered menial, and they had done it so well that everyone else had forgotten it needed to be done at all. The question now, Shentar concluded, was whether the council could change its fundamental attitudes about work and value, or whether it would continue to struggle with crises that would only grow worse over time. The humans were gone, and they had shown no signs of returning, and the council needed to decide if it wanted to learn from this experience or simply try to find new species to exploit for essential labor. The formal apology from the Galactic Council was broadcast across every communication channel in council space and beyond, reaching even the human colonies that had withdrawn into isolation, and Chancellor Vortek delivered the message personally, rather than delegating it to a subordinate as protocol would normally allow. He stood alone at the podium in the grand chamber, looking directly into the cameras that would carry his words across light years of space. And for the first time in his 20 years as chancellor, he spoke without notes or prepared remarks, letting his genuine remorse and understanding guide his words. He acknowledged that the council had failed to recognize humanity's essential contributions until they were gone, had treated humans as insignificant when they had actually been the foundation supporting council expansion, and had allowed a culture to develop where essential work was undervalued while prestigious but less critical work received all the recognition and rewards. Vortek announced that the council was offering full reparations for any financial losses humanity had incurred during their withdrawal, enhanced membership status with voting rights equal to the core founding species, and a permanent seat on the council's executive board with veto power over major policy decisions. Beyond these formal offers, he also announced sweeping reforms to council labor policies, creating new pay structures that valued essential services appropriately. establishing training programs to teach council species how to do the maintenance and support work that humans had been doing, and implementing recognition systems for workers in unglamorous but critical positions. He ended by saying that the council understood if humanity chose not to return, because trust once broken was difficult to rebuild, but he hoped that someday humans might be willing to give them another chance to prove they had learned from their mistakes. On Earth, President Helen Martinez convened her cabinet in the Situation Room beneath the White House, gathering the key advisors and former council representatives to discuss how humanity should respond to the council's offer. The debate lasted for hours, with different factions arguing for immediate acceptance, complete rejection, or various conditional arrangements. Admiral Patricia Cole, who commanded Earth's defense forces, argued that the council needed to prove they understood the lesson rather than just offering money and titles, because throwing resources at the problem without changing fundamental attitudes would lead to the same situation repeating in a generation or two. Defense Minister Carlos Webb pointed out that the Bay Council's military vulnerabilities had grown severe enough that the Krathian Empire was preparing for a major offensive, and if the council fell, humanity would face threats on every border. Commerce Secretary Linda Shaw argued that Earth's economy had actually improved since withdrawing from the council, because human workers were no longer subsidizing other species by doing essential work at below market rates, and returning to that arrangement would harm human prosperity. Ambassador Daniel Wright listened to all the arguments before speaking, and when he finally offered his perspective, the room fell silent to hear from the man who had delivered humanity's withdrawal notice. Daniel suggested a conditional return based on teaching rather than doing, explaining that the council species needed to learn how to value and perform essential work themselves, and humanity could provide expertise and training without carrying the full burden alone. He proposed sending human advisors to teach council species about maintenance, emergency response, logistics, and other critical services, but requiring that council workers actually do the work themselves, rather than relying on humans to fix everything. The council would need to restructure its economy to properly compensate essential workers, create career paths that made unglamorous work attractive and respected, and demonstrate over several years that they had genuinely changed their culture before humanity would consider full re-engagement. President Martinez liked the approach because it would help the council without allowing them to exploit human labor again, and after further debate, the cabinet agreed to propose this conditional arrangement. Martinez appointed Daniel to lead the negotiating team, and within 2 weeks, he was back in the council chambers he had left 2 years earlier, sitting across from Chancellor Vortek and other council leaders to discuss terms. The negotiations were difficult, with some council members objecting to conditions they saw as insulting or excessive, but Vortek supported the human position, understanding that trust needed to be earned through demonstrated change rather than purchased with offers and promises. The agreement that emerged from 3 months of negotiations established a 5-year transition plan where human advisors would train council workers in essential services while the council implemented structural reforms to its economy and culture. Humans would be paid market rates for their advisory services, would not be expected to do the actual maintenance and support work themselves, and would have authority to evaluate whether council workers were learning effectively. The council committed to publishing annual reports on their progress, including data on employment in essential services, compensation levels, and worker satisfaction, with independent human auditors verifying the accuracy of these reports. Over the following 6 months, delegations from 12 council species visited Earth, and they were not the proud diplomats who had once treated humanity with casual dismissal, but rather engineers, doctors, logistics officers, and other workers who came to learn. They visited human hospitals to understand how medical care could be delivered efficiently to remote areas, toured human freight operations to learn about logistics planning and risk management, and spent time in human maintenance facilities watching technicians who took pride in keeping equipment running smoothly. Some of the visitors quit and returned home, finding the work beneath their dignity or too demanding for their tastes. But others stayed and genuinely tried to learn, beginning to understand the mindset that had made humans so effective. Captain Lisa Morgan returned to the Andorian trade station, but this time she came as an instructor rather than a freight captain, and she spent her days teaching young Andorian pilots about long-haul operations through dangerous space. She showed them how to plan routes through asteroid fields, how to maintain ships under harsh conditions, and how to stay alert during long stretches of monotonous travel, punctuated by moments of intense danger. Many of her students struggled with the psychological demands of the work, finding it lonely and unrewarding, but a few discovered they enjoyed the challenge and the satisfaction of delivering critical supplies to remote outposts that depended on regular deliveries. Lisa told her students, honestly, that this work would never make them famous or wealthy, that they would spend weeks alone in space making runs that other pilots refused, and that their success would be measured by the absence of problems rather than the presence of glory. Some students quit after hearing this, but those who stayed began to develop the dedication and professionalism that had characterized human freight operations, understanding that their work mattered even if no one noticed it most of the time. On Kelser Prime, Dr. Susan Mills returned to train local medical staff in frontier healthcare, bringing with her a team of experienced human doctors who had worked in remote and dangerous environments across human space. They taught Kelsorian doctors and nurses not just medical techniques, but also the attitudes and approaches needed to provide quality care under difficult conditions with limited resources. Susan emphasized that frontier medicine required creativity, dedication, and a genuine commitment to patient welfare regardless of ability to pay or social status, and she was pleased to see some of her students embracing these principles rather than just learning procedures by rote. The training programs expanded across council space over the next 2 years, with hundreds of human advisors working in dozens of locations to transfer knowledge and help council species develop their own capabilities in essential services. Progress was uneven, with some species adapting quickly and others struggling to overcome cultural biases against unglamorous work. But overall, the trajectory was positive. The council published its first annual progress report 18 months into the transition plan, and Daniel Wright reviewed it carefully before meeting with President Martinez to discuss whether humanity should continue its conditional engagement. The report showed measurable improvements in several areas, including increased enrollment in training programs for essential services, higher compensation for maintenance and support workers, and reduced failure rates in infrastructure systems as newly trained workers gained competence. However, the report also showed persistent challenges, particularly in changing cultural attitudes among core world populations who still viewed certain types of work as beneath educated or ambitious individuals. Daniel told Martinez that the council was making genuine efforts but needed more time to achieve lasting cultural change, and she agreed to continue the advisory program while maintaining careful monitoring. 3 years after humanity's quiet departure, the relationship between humans and the Galactic Council had fundamentally changed from what it had been during the 70 years of initial membership.